Oh, great. So it's my great pleasure to welcome Lynn Robertson. She is my friend and a professor of psychology and neuroscience at UC Berkeley. She has pretty much dedicated her entire life to studying the effects of selective attention and perceptual organization on the final outcome of perception in normal people as well as people with neurological damage. And today she is going to talk to us about prosopagnosia, which is a specific deficit that affects some people, cognitive and neural contributions to face blindness.
Well, this is very interesting to be here and be able to talk to a group of individuals that are in business rather than in the academic culture. Although I'm not downgrading that at all, I think it's just marvelous that these sorts of things are happening and that many of our students coming out are ending up in places like this, and that we have something of value to offer. Anyway, my background, I went to UC Berkeley actually as a graduate student, and shortly thereafter went to UCSF and I studied cognitive sciences and cognitive psychology at Berkeley. I shortly thereafter found myself in a postdoc at UCSF, and that's where I discovered neuropsychology. So my background is an experimental psychologist, but I've been enmeshed my whole life, since I got my PhD at least, in a world of neurology. And I was, in fact, in a neurology department until '98 when I came back to Berkeley. And now I'm part of the psychology department. This is a fairly recent topic for me, although I think it's a natural outgrowth. And I'll get to it right away by saying first, there are two types of prosopagnosia. Acquired, which can be acquired through traumatic brain injury or stroke or that sort of thing. Many of our vets who are coming home from Iraq with TBI we're finding that they have an acquired prosopagnosia along with all the other sorts of problems that they have. And then there's also developmental prosopagnosia, or sometimes called congenital prosopagnosia. We'll call it developmental prosopagnosia and refer to it as DP. And this is what I'm going to talk about today, is this developmental type of prosopagnosia. These are individuals who have never, ever learned to discriminate faces, so they can't recognize sometimes their own family members by face alone. It was considered very rare once upon a time, although we're finding out there's more and more people with these problems. So for instance, if given pictures such as this, most of us would have no trouble saying this is Ronald Reagan. I'm having trouble with him. Stallone. What's his first name? Rocky. And Bill Clinton tends to stand out. Charlie Chaplin, that's for the older prosopagnosics. But they would have difficulty looking at these for as long as possible and being able to tell you with any certainty who these individuals are. If you do something like this, and you just have them say yes or no, so does this name down here match this face here? Well, of course, this is yes, yes, no, no, but they may be anywhere from 50 to 70% incorrect. Of course, they can find distinguishing features and use those, but is this Jack Nicholson? Maybe. How about this? Henry Kissinger? Well, I don't know. I think he wears glasses, things of that nature. Yet they don't have trouble seeing a face as a face. The face, they say, is clear to them, as clear as any other objects. And when you give them degraded types of stimuli, such as these sorts of figures, most of us will see a face over here, so will prosopagnosics see a face over here. So it's not really face blindness per se. It's actually a situation where you see clearly the face. You're able to see that it's an organization of a face and recognize it as a face, but you just don't discriminate it from other faces that may be around it. Paradoxically, they're better at some tasks than we are. So for instance, if these are called composite faces, the top half of all of these figures are the same. But here what has happened is this has been split in half So the bottom half is over here, and here it's part of the gestalt, the whole. Prosopagnosics will have no trouble telling us that these are the same and that these are the same. They will be no slower here and here. Yet people who normally have good face perception find it much easier to say that these two are the same on the top than that these two are the same on the top. And that's because you have to break the configuration here in order to do that task. Examples of some of the statements that developmental prosopagnosics have told us. I avoid places I could run into someone I know because I may not recognize them. I pretend to be lost in thought when walking down the street. I act friendly to everyone just in case I know them. And then there's others that say, I act friendly to no one just in case I don't know them. And one person said, standing in front of a mirror in a crowded public restroom, I have had to make a funny face so that I could tell which one was me. So even their own face, which they see every morning in the mirror when they brush their teeth, if they're in a crowded scene with a lot of people, a lot of faces in the mirror, they may have trouble. That doesn't mean they don't recognize people by other means. They do, and what they tell us is they might use the gait. They're very attuned to gait, actually, mannerisms of people, and often hair or other sorts of distinguishing features to try to determine who that person might be. Well, this was once, as I said, this was once thought to be extremely rare, and up until 1990, there were only 2 cases of developmental prosopagnosia reported in the scientific literature, in neuropsychological and neurology literature. The last 10 years, there have been many developmental prosopagnosics that have emerged, and many of them have been studied, so there's far more studies, and we can thank the internet for that. And it's, I guess, probably especially Google sort of search engines, so that someone who is a little embarrassed about not being able to recognize faces can sit alone in their own room and look up prosopagnosia or face blindness and try to find out something about themselves and trying to find out if there's other people out there like themselves. Well, so through the internet, we've been able to place certain things, certain sort of questionnaires and so on, those of us who do research, to try to recruit individuals with this problem. Ken Nakayama in Harvard estimates that there are 2% of the population is prosopagnosia. Well, developmentally. We don't know if that's true or not. Seems rather high. But the current estimates are somewhere between 1%, and 2%. So you can see that in a population like the Bay Area, there are quite a few people who have never learned to be able to recognize faces. Severity is an issue, and we'll get to that in a moment. Oh, also, a recent article has shown that, well, we always knew, actually, that it ran in families, but this particular article showed that there were 50 prosopagnosic within a few square miles in a small German city. And these are families that have been there for many, many years. So again, suggesting that there is probably some genetic property to it. Well, our face is special because these people who have developmental prosopagnosia don't have obvious problems in vision, in organizing the visual world in other ways. So they can see the crowd of people in here and organize that perfectly well. Their visual acuity is fine. They have normal intelligence, et cetera, et cetera. So does this mean that faces are special? Well, this came up many years ago, actually, in the 60s or 50s, when developmental psychologists started studying faces, started studying face perception and perceptual development in newborns. And newborns do respond to faces rather different than they respond to other things. But of course, newborns, this is like within the first few days or within the month after birth, newborns have undeveloped brains, and they also have impoverished sensory input. And yet, if you show a newborn this, or a group of newborns really, any of these up here, just individually, if you show that to a newborn, they'll look at it for longer. Then they'll look at other things. They're interested in these three as compared to these three. Now here you have a lot more energy coming off of this oval of this face, and yet they don't think that's as interesting as they do these. Here you have the same features, the eyes, nose, and mouth, but they're rearranged differently. Newborns don't think that's very interesting either. But what's really interesting to me is that newborns don't think this is very interesting either. And yet they like that one a lot. And the only difference is that the two eyes are up here in this one, and they're down here in this one. This is more like what a newborn would see. Very, very fuzzy world. And if you show them, I mean, this is what they're seeing, but if you show them a broad band, upright or upside down face, they will prefer to look at this one. So already, they're looking at faces where the two eyes are up top in the oval. And this is what made people really start thinking that faces might be special, that we may be born with a bias to look at faces. More recently, however, what we found out through some work of Mark Johnson and others is that if you put this face here like this, two eyes above what might be a nose or mouth, versus you do it upside down but put everything at the top of the oval, now the babies will prefer this over this because there's more contrast here, there's more stuff, more energy coming off of the stimulus in this area of the oval than over here, even though this looks more like a face. So that makes everybody say, whoops, no, faces are not special, but this may be the mechanism by which faces do become special. That is, we come to the world, this is the other argument, we come to the world with a bias to look at things towards the top here, to look at the stuff and contrast towards the top here. And part of that is due, the claim is, because there's earlier development within ventral pathways of the brain than dorsal pathways. So this just holds for the infant more information above than below in this oval. Now, you can take that with a grain of salt if you want. It's debatable, and lots of studies are going on in the developmental literature about it. But for now, I just want to point out that the facts are that something at energy in the top oval is more important than energy in the bottom when you're born. This may be why later on in life we still continue to have problems recognizing upside down faces. So if you look at these two faces right here, and you may or may not, hopefully you will not, see that this one is the upside down version of this, and this one is the upside down version of this. If you look at these two, they're easy to tell apart. If you look at these two, they're difficult to tell apart. So these two look like individual people, and these two not so much. So what goes wrong in developmental prosopagnosia? Because most of us develop from these early biases in vision that we may come equipped with, to being extremely good at recognizing faces. But there's some people who just never are able to learn that ability. Well, this work was done with Joe DeGutis, who's sitting right here, who is a UC Berkeley graduate as well, but he's now doing a postdoc at Harvard in the Veterans Administration in Boston, back here for a wedding and to follow up on some of the work that we've started doing. What we do to recruit people with developmental prosopagnosia is we have just a screening questionnaire on the net. And if you go into my homepage, you would find a much longer set of questions for you to answer. And here are some of the examples of what's on this page. Do you fail to recognize a close friend or relative by sight? Well, the answer to that, if you're prosopagnosic, is yes. Does it happen often when meeting a familiar person out of context? And the answer to that, if you're prosopagnosic, is yes. Even some of us who don't think we're prosopagnosic, but maybe I am, have a problem with that. Do you also have trouble recognizing facial expressions or understanding the intentions or emotion and state of the others? Exactly. So if you are really prosopagnosic, you should say no to this. If you're just pretending, you'll probably say yes. Do you have trouble distinguishing other classes of objects, such as cars, shoes, or coats? The answer to that is no. And have you
Cars,
You're an expert in cars.
no.
No? Okay. He's going to keep me honest. Have you consulted a physician regarding these problems? Now, if they answer no to this, they're probably a developmental prosopagnosic, along with other screening questions we have. If they answer yes to this, we would probably still contact them, because if they have gone to a physician over this, they probably have had some head trauma of some sort. So they would go into the other group, the acquired prosopagnosia group. All right? Because most people with developmental prosopagnosic don't go to a physician and say, what's wrong with me? I can't recognize faces. In fact, I have not heard of one case doing that. And then if they're willing to be in the experiments and so on, they come into the laboratory, we give them a structured interview, and we also give them several standard neuropsychological tests, as well as some cognitive tests that we have developed that are computerized, measuring accuracy and reaction time. Here is an example of the type of performance you'll find with a developmental prosopagnosic. Don't worry about all this word here, that's too noisy. But this is MZ, I'll refer to her. She's a 51-year-old woman who's in our project. She has normal visual acuity, normal contrast sensitivity, above normal intelligence. She's neurologically intact. She's really with it. And I won't go through what all of these tests are, but just I will point out that the red one, the pink one, and the yellow one are all about faces, whereas the green one is memory for words. So like the Warrington faces and Warrington words, it's the same procedure exactly. You're shown a bunch of faces. You're asked later to pick out which ones you saw. Or you're shown a bunch of words. You're asked to pick out which ones you saw. What you see here in the normal distribution, this being normal, is that her performance on the Warrington faces is down here, outside the range of normal, whereas her memory for words is fine. So we can be pretty well assured that her memory is fine. It's not a memory problem per se. And then, of course, on the other types of face tests, she's also down here. One would never expect a developmental prosopagnosic to be very good at famous faces, because if you've never been able to recognize faces or learn to recognize faces, then you're going to have a hard time setting up a representation of what is famous, what face is famous. Okay. Then we do some computerized tests as well. We'll show this maybe for 5 seconds. Half a second? Okay. And then there's a small blank. And then you're supposed to pick out which of these faces you just saw. Was that hard? No? Okay, it shouldn't be hard for a person that has normal face perception.
Which is it?
Yeah, it's this one right here. I'm right? I didn't look.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you can't do it, talk to me afterwards.
Yes. Yeah, so normal face perceivers are very good at this. And people with developmental prosopagnosia are very poor.
What if you have trouble telling that they're 4 different?
You have trouble telling there's 4 different people.
Like they look like the same.
They all look like the same person to you?
Yeah, with different
Uh-huh.
directions that they were pointing at the camera.
Uh-huh. Well, talk to us. Actually, they are very similar in the sense that their hair is gone and so on, so the distinguishing features are gone, although this one should be quite distinguishable from this one given the nose.
Yeah, that's how I could tell that there was a difference. Okay, I looked, okay.
Yeah.
Faces are helpful.
Yeah, okay, okay. You might have a bit. Well, biological markers of face perception also have suggested to people that faces are special. And I'll first go through electrophysiology. I'm going to go back to that last slide, though, back. Actually, a slide right here, because I forgot to mention something. And that is that, remember MZ and her performance, because we studied MZ for nearly 3 years now. And so we have, and she was one of our first, so we have more data on her than we have on everybody else. And so I'm going to especially focus on her results as we go through this. It's still difficult, by the way, to get a large group of developmental prosopagnosics. I work with a colleague in Israel, and together we have 8. So we look for people who are in the severe range. We want to make sure they're clearly prosopagnosic and not just sort of at the end of the distribution, although that's one question right now that is in the literature on this, is whether prosopagnosia is actually a qualitative or quantitative difference than just normal phase perception. Okay. So, EEGs, I don't know really how much you know about ERPs and FMR and all that sort of thing. I'm going to assume not much, because maybe someone in here doesn't know much. But anyway, what we do is this is a top version of the head with the nose up here and the ears out here. And we have sensors, electronic sensors, that we attach to the scalp all along here. All the even numbers are in the right hemisphere, all the odd on the left. And we're going to be especially interested on what comes out of P07 and P08, and I'll tell you why in a minute. Oh, that's not supposed to do that. Okay. At each of these lead sites, what happens is you show a stimulus and you get an EEG wave. And so for a single trial, things might look like this. But as you go on and get more and more trials, what's happening is that in these bumps are starting to form a pattern of sorts. And by the time you get down to, say, 150 or maybe sometimes 100 trials, depending on how much signal-noise ratio you have, you can get a fairly nice-looking waveform that looks like this. Now, what's happening here is this is being plotted. This vertical line here represents the moment at which the stimulus comes on. The axis here shows you timing, that is, how long after the stimulus came on in milliseconds do these waves happen. And what you get here is what's a nice P1, positive, up, negative, down, a nice P1, which is thought to be more very close to the sensory automatic sort of thing. And then you get a very big dip around here, and this happens at about about 170 milliseconds after the stimulus. And this will happen to any visual stimulus. So you get it to objects or scenes or faces or anything. We're going to call this the N170, although it can show up anywhere between 140 and 200 milliseconds. But you'll get this pattern. Now, through a great deal of studies, this has been replicated over and over again, we know that when a face is presented, that the N170 amplitude is much greater than when any other type of visual stimulus is presented. So here's where the stimulus comes on. At about 170 milliseconds, you see that all these other types of stimuli, even though they're very different in terms of their spectrum, they have overlapping. This is an N170 right here, because even though it doesn't go way negative, it's going negative going. So these are all clustering around here. But now you show a face and whomp. And this is very reliable. You get it in 98% of normal individuals that you test. Now I didn't have time to actually fix this for you to make it easy for you to understand this. But this is a study, an ERP study. Same sort of thing. They're showing objects and faces. And you're just passively viewing them, by the way. They're just coming up one at a time, like this. Objects and faces. And again, they're looking at the N170, because the N170 in the normal literature seems to be a face-specific marker. Don't know what it does exactly, but it is a face-specific marker. The thing that is confusing about this is that now negative is up and positive is down, and that's medical convention. And these are patients, actually. These are people who have acquired prosopagnosia from a very small lesion. And what you see here is this is the N170 in young controls. In older controls, somewhat smaller, that difference right there. But it is there, and it's absent in both of these patients. Now, those are patients who have acquired prosopagnosia. We do know now, though, that there are a number of individuals who have developmental prosopagnosia who show either a significantly reduced N170 or no N170 at all. If you look here, this is the N170, going right there. That's control in the left, over the left hemisphere, P7, P8, over the right hemisphere. Nice and gigantic. The faces are blue, the objects are red. And here is a single case called YT, where you see that the N170 is basically absent almost over here. And here it's not, it's highly significantly different, very much diminished. In our own lab, we have found this as well. These are two of our prosopagnosics, developmental. And here's a control group. In this case, all people were doing was looking at a series of pictures coming in, and there were either faces or watches or other objects, and they were just responding whenever they saw a flower. So they're not responding to the faces or the objects in any way. They're just responding whenever a flower shows up. So then we can compare what the N170 looks like when the watch appears versus when the face appears. And in controls, we get the expected nice N170, because green is the watches, red are the faces. There's the nice N170. In KW, you see none. In MZ, the person we saw the performance of, you see none. So these are three, at least, we have fourth, who do not show this N170 effect. Others have not been studied that well yet to know whether they have reduced N170s or not, but at least in terms of the electrophysiological marker for face perception, the developmental prosopagnosics seemed not to have it. There's also another biomarker of face processing that has received quite a bit of attention, and this is called the fusiform face area. This is, was discovered through fMR, and if you look at the brain, this is a cut of the brain very low through here, and underneath, the very bottom, in the fusiform gyrus, there are a couple of areas that are very active when faces are presented compared to when other sorts of visual stimuli are presented. So for instance, if you have this, in this case, actually, this particular scan was, just tell me whether that was the same as that. So you're actually responding to the faces and the scenes. But when you're responding, but anyway, whether you respond to them or whether you don't, what happens is you get a nice FFA, stronger usually in the right hemisphere than the left. So this is highly active when these faces show up, small little bit over here, and also in the occipital fusiform area, which is posterior to that, also over here. And of course, the visual cortex is here and back up a bit. If there's questions, interrupt me, okay? All right, this is the first study that I know of that had several, it's CP here, that's congenital prosopagnosic, it's the same as developmental prosopagnosia, because this is a figure right out of this, this article. And this is an inflated brain, so it looks a little different. I don't know if you've been used to seeing these sorts of things, but what it does is to keep, the gyri are gray and the sulci are white, and it also inflates it so that the underside of the brain comes out, and you can see it on the surface here. All you really need to know is, oh, and this is the front of the brain, the back of the brain. All you really need to see here is, here's 10 controls when they're seeing faces versus buildings. So here's a face effect, the FFA, right there on the right, stronger on the right as usual, then on the left. And here are the four prosopagnosics. And you see here, this is really quite normal, right? So the FFA has generated a huge amount of interest in terms of its face specificity and its involvement in face recognition and normal face perception. And yet, what we see here is in congenital prosopagnosics who have never been able to recognize anybody in their life have this beautiful FFA and OFA. And MZ, again, the one who did not have the N170, she too has a normal face FFA and OFA. So here again is a replication. So what we've seen so far now in developmental prosopagnosia is that the N170 is very abnormal. The fMRI is normal. The implications for that are that the N170 and these face areas that we see activated on fMR are measuring different aspects of face processing. We'll get back to that later on because, yes?
When you had those 4 pictures of brains up there, the ones with the CP,
Yes.
They had other areas that
Yes.
were red that weren't in the control.
Yes.
Are those important at all?
Don't know.
Typically for object recognition, face recognition, frontal regions aren't as important. So they usually don't correlate with the ability to recognize objects from faces. So, but there are some differences. It also looks like this, for the congenital prosopagnosics, like they may be more dispersed. Like in terms of the activity down in the face area and occipital face
Yeah,
area.
but these are significant effects up here and in here. So whatever they're doing with faces, the frontal lobe is acting differently in developmental prosopagnosics than controls, but we don't really know why.
But there's no one's ever shown any differences in front.
No one has ever shown any differences in the frontal lobe. And when you get frontal lesions, for instance, you don't lose the ability to recognize faces. So,
Can it be
what?
compensation?
Oh, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong person. Yeah,
Can it be compensation, like they're trying to do something else because the normal areas don't work?
possibly, definitely. And we know that when you're trying to do something, you're engaging control mechanisms that you get more frontal activity. And so if face processing is hard for them, perhaps it's not surprising to find that there. Yeah.
Since we're asking questions, earlier in the 170 responses, it looked, to me anyway, it looked like the problem isn't so much that they're not responding to faces, is they're responding
Yes.
to everything else as if it were a face.
That's very good, yes. And we don't know exactly why that is, but this is what we think is going on. That what this N170 is representing is actually the distinction between objects and faces. So if you're born into the world and you don't have the category of objects and faces yet, everything is streaming down the same pathway. It's only when you start recognizing that objects are special and you need to deal with them specially that you try to put up this categorization. So we believe, this is a working hypothesis, nothing more, it's really post hoc. We believe that what's going on is that, yes, objects are actually going in through a different pathway, and therefore you're not going to get the magnitude of the N170 here. But, so it's an early categorization response. So the fact that they aren't different, whether they're both objects or whether they're both faces, if they were both here or both here, it would sort of say the same thing. So you need that early categorization response in order to deal with faces in the special way you do. Maybe. Okay. Okay, here are our questions in the study I'm going to tell you about. Why does the N170 reflect face recognition abilities in developmental prosopagnosics while the FFA does not? These things are coming from the posterior areas. If you had a face-specific area, which again is debatable, but certainly things respond more to faces than others on the whole. You really need an N170 and an FFA. Why aren't they connected? What visual information is necessary to recognize faces? And maybe we can find this out by studying developmental prosopagnosics. And can face recognition be learned? And I'm going to start with the last question, which is, can face perception be learned? Because some of the answers to the other questions fall out from what we find out about this question. Can face perception be learned in developmental prosopagnosic? It obviously can be learned in children and so on. And the answer is yes. And we have tried this training program that I'm going to show you. It's a computerized training program. It's very easy. We've tried it in 5 prosopagnosics now, and it has been successful in 3. We do not know why it has not been successful in the other 2. One of the other 2 is showing a trend. He's in his teenagers or late teens, and the other one is just not showing anything. But we do have 3 people who have never been able to recognize faces in their life, now going out in the world and reporting that they can recognize faces, and I'll show you data that says they are. Well, we entered this, or after going through the literature, we decided to start with this sort of a task. It's a configural task, that is configural training, where we know that developmental prosopagnosics have difficulty seeing these 2 as different. Do you see them as different?
I do, but consciously looking for differences.
Okay. Do you see them as different? Yeah. Okay. Okay, so they have difficulty seeing these. And as you can see, what happens, well, maybe you can't see, I don't know. But if you have good face recognition abilities, this looks like a different person than this, but all that we've done here is to move the eyes and mouth further apart a little bit. And not by very much. And that's what we're going to do in this training. It's configural training. We think that it's very important, this second order configural information of the small spacing differences between the features of the eyes, nose, and mouth in face recognition. So all we're going to do in this is to move up and down the mouth from the nose, or to move the eyebrows and eyes, move that difference up here. And this is, you just have to take my word for it right now. There's plenty of evidence in the literature. But this particular triangle here is very important in face recognition. And it appears that, at least not always, but it appears that a large part of face discrimination is knowing the aspect ratio of the spacing between the eyes, the nose, and the mouth. So we're going to train that and see what happens. And I already told you that we're going to be successful, so you might as well, so it is successful. And if you want yourself just to feel whether the aspect ratio is important or not, if I give you these 3 circles here, and I ask you which of these 2 on the side looks most like this? Well, in both cases, the eyes and the nose and the mouth have been moved. But in this case, this triangle has become narrower. And in this case, this triangle has the same aspect ratio as this triangle. And most people will say that this face looks more like this than this. Now remember when I told you about turning things upside down babies? Well, even we don't do very well when we're asked to compare these in terms of upside down faces. So now if you ask which one looks most like this, normals will be about 50% of choosing this one or this one. So being upright or being upside down really matters somehow in face recognition. So the training program goes something like this. The person comes in, and we have John and Joe or whatever. And we say, okay, these are the faces that you are going to see. And all of these are in the category of Joe. So when a face like that shows up, press the left-hand button. And all of these are in the category of Jim. So when a face like that, one of those faces shows up, you just press the right-hand button. And what we're varying here, again, is the eyebrow height and the mouth height. And that's all we're doing. So these 2 are very similar to each other. MZ, who I'm going to focus on because she was the best subject to do this, and she was willing to go off the training and on the training and help us out with all these things. I think we've learned a lot from her. Was willing to come in, first of all, and do 750 trials per day for 6 days, which equaled 4,500 trials of this really boring task. So all that happens is this face shows up. She says, is it category 1 or category 2 by pressing the right button. 500 milliseconds later, the face is still there. She gets feedback. It says whether she was correct on that trial or not. And it says overall what her percent correct is up to that point. So she's being given feedback. We change the faces each day for 6 days, so they're a little different. Different hair. Okay. And what you see here, and this is the training, this is over the 4,000 trials, 6 days. This is plotted reaction time here. She starts out at about 13 seconds, goes down over time, and asymptotes after about, say 2,000 trials. Her accuracy, which is plotted over here, starts at around 75%. Remember, there's very large differences in there too. 75%, and goes up gradually until she asymptotes at about 2,500 on accuracy. So you can see that these reflect each other, that reaction time and accuracy reflect each other well. All right, after this training, what happened to her ability to recognize faces? First of all, she was stunned that she could go out in the world and actually recognize some people from others. And she reported this to us. So it appears to happen in the real world. Other people that she knows are reporting this as well. This was before training. Remember those faces and words tests where words were really good and faces were really bad? This is after training for 6 days with this thing. So here's the face task right in the middle, the memory task right in the middle. Here's a matching task, the pink one, which is still in the normal range. Here's the famous faces still down here. And again, famous faces are not famous for her. So of course she's not good at it. And then just to make sure that this wasn't due to some sort of practice, we added a new test, norm test, just to make sure that something she'd never seen before that she would get better at. And that's this blue one right here, and indeed she does.
Just as a side note, we had her go back and learn the famous faces. Once she learned the famous faces, she aced the famous faces. So it was just because she wasn't exposed to those faces. She had this mechanism on, and she had to be re-exposed to these faces.
What happens to her N170 before training? You saw this. After training, it's normal. Here's the controls. That's the microvolts of the controls, which aren't on here. This was before training, and this is after, so you can see that the N170 effect is within the normal range. Of course, not much happens to the FFA because it was normal to begin with. And if you just look at the activity actually before and after, so the open bars are before, the dark bars are after, you can see that there's really no change in the signal that is coming from these areas. But that doesn't mean they're normal. It turns out that if you do the right analysis, you find that what has happened after this training is there's increased coherence between areas of the brain that respond to faces. Now, how do you measure coherence? Well, this is measuring it this is an example of from left and right cortex. And so say you have a signal here and a signal here. Now, after the stimulus goes off for several seconds, there's actually fluctuation in the signal that goes along until it dissipates. So here the left side is in blue, and so this kind of goes like this for a while. And over here is in red, and that goes kind of there for a while. And they sort of look like they're on top of each other. Now, if you just correlated them, you wouldn't get much of an effect, because there's this lag here. So what this coherence analysis does is correct for that and gives you a coherence value. And these are just in the low frequency, the low frequencies. And what it does is give you a coherence value. So you can think of that as a correlation with the time lag corrected. and now it's 71. So in this particular case, where someone was looking at coherence between left and right hemispheres, there was 71.71 coherence. A score of 0, of course, is no coherence. 1 is total coherence. And we measured the coherence between the FFA and the OFA for MZ before and after training. This is the coherence value before training, these open bars. There's some coherence between these two areas, the FFA and OFA. It's not very much. This is measured in an FMR taken right after the training. You can see the coherence goes up enormously. And after a little bit, a day or two after that, it's starting to go down. But it's still better than baseline.
So what happens a month or two after training?
Going to get to that right now, actually. Her subjective report, while she was doing this is something, one of the things that she said. It's really extraordinary how hours in front of a computer changed how I view the world, have viewed the world for decades. It's as though a process was started in the lab and it fed upon itself, taking on a life of its own. And the problem is, though, the effects disappeared when training stopped. Okay? Now,
for a couple months, though.
yeah.
So it's okay.
Now, you say, oh, God, you put me through all this, and, and now what are you telling me? Well, I'm telling you that from an experimental point of view, this is a good thing. Because we can retrain. And so we do. We retrain. And here is the baseline that you saw in coherence. This is when she was poor at face recognition. These are the two coherence measures you saw before when she was good. This is when she loses it again and reports that she loses it, and on our test she loses it. Poor, it goes back to baseline. Here is the retraining starting up again, and here it goes back to baseline. Yes?
Retraining work faster than...
Yes, there is savings. There is definite savings. So she no longer has to go through 4,000 trials, especially now. Actually, she has gone through so much training with us, and she's been so sweet because she's willing to go off of it so that she goes back to baseline so that we can try something new. The others aren't so willing to do that. But we try to talk them into it. But you can see here, look at the reaction time, 3,500 milliseconds as opposed to 13. And she comes down, and it's below 1,000 as opposed to below 2,000. And so, yes, there is savings. And at this point, actually, what we did is, we're done with these sorts of things. And so we put the training program on her computer at home. And every morning she gets up, and for about 10 minutes, 15 minutes a day, she does the training, and she's good to go for the day. So the message there is we have to change our way of thinking about rehabilitation, especially cognitive rehabilitation. And this is more like, well, if you had high blood pressure, you'd have to take a pill every morning. Well, if you have developmental prosopagnosia the way she has it, then what she has to do is sit down at the computer every morning. And so it's a maintenance sort of thing for her. One of our others actually went for 3 months? 100 days before she started dissipating. So it looks like there's a big individual difference in terms of how often and how long you might have to train. But this works. Well, why did training work? Maybe it's just exposure to thousands of faces. You see a lot of faces like that? You get better. Or did we really train configurable processes as we thought we were doing? And specifically, would it be to upright faces as you would expect from the normal face literature? Whoops, that's bad. Or did we train to features, whether they were spatial or not? So this is what we use with our standard training, of course. And now what we did to see whether it was upright specific is train her for thousands of trials with upside down faces. And again, we just varied the distance between the mouth and the nose, or the eyebrows and the eyes. So we did the same here as we did here. And then we took her off of that. And then she trained for thousands, and we tested her. And then she trained for thousands of trials here, where there's It's a feature color difference. It's not really color, it's brightness. There's a slight dimming or it's really luminous. So there's a slight dimming of the mouth or the eyes. But we did it that way to make it equally difficult. And what happens there, you don't have to try to comprehend this because it's kind of late in the day, and it's maybe I've overdone the amount of data I've shown you. Anyway, but here's in the inverted face training. When we tested her on upright faces, this is before training with inverted faces. This is after she gets worse. Now, if you show her a bunch of inverted faces, she gets better. But that's not what we're seeking here. But she gets worse here. On the feature training, there's just no difference before and after training. So it's not just the amount of times that she saw a face or that there was some change, but it has to do with the configural training. Yes?
What sort of accuracy would a normal person see those trainers?
If we trained normal people for, well, we haven't found a normal person that's willing to sit down for 4,000 trials.
So is your question, would normal people perform in this test, or if you train, can normal people become a super face recognizer?
No, I'm just asking if when she achieves her 90% accuracy, is that with the normal realm, or is that better than?
Well, we don't know on these tests for sure. We do know on the neuropsych test because those are normed. And certainly her Warrington face memory was right at normal. It's not as good as her memory for words yet, so it probably is not perfect, but it's at least normal, yeah.
She can perform the training task better than anybody else. She can also do as well on the face tests as anybody else. So she's, by every measure that we have, she looks normal on face perception.
There were times early on, before we did any of this, that she would come into the lab and not recognize people. And you can almost tell whether she's on her training or not and whether she's recognizing people in the lab. She recognizes you now, even when she's not been trained, right? You don't know?
So what happened?
Yeah.
Curious, what would happen if you train a normal person on the upside down faces?
Yes.
Would they become better at recognizing them? Would they become worse at
I don't know.
normal faces?
Yeah, you would predict from this that they should, right? That they should get worse at recognizing upright faces and better at recognizing inverted faces.
Yeah, the question is, are you really invoking the normal face detection
Yes.
circuits, or are you just training it via other brain systems to
Right.
work around it?
Yeah, no, I agree. That is the million-dollar question right now. That is, I'm supposed to repeat the questions. This question was whether we're really training normal circuits or are we training some other circuits that are still abnormal but acting a little differently but allow face perception. Okay, so I'm almost done. In summary, individuals with developmental prosopagnosic can be trained to discriminate faces. The new skill is not due to mere exposure, not due to learned strategies. Changes face. It's not due to mere exposure, and it's not due to learned strategies because you lose it. And the training changes face-specific neurobiological markers, both the N170 and at least the coherence between areas in the posterior part of the cortex that normally respond to faces. And it fades without training. I told you that. I'll go on to the next one. And we'll come back to the questions that we were asking when we started this study. Why does the N170 reflect face recognition abilities in developmental prosopagnosics while the FFA does not? Well, face recognition requires coherence among many face-sensitive areas in the cortex, and we saw that coherence measure in the fMR. And it may be this coherence measure that will actually correlate with the N170. So it may be the coherence that is required in order to generate that N170 face-specific effect. What visual information is necessary to recognize faces? At least one big important one is sensitivity to aspect ratio between the features of a face, or what I'm calling configural processing. And can face recognition be learned in adults with developmental prosopagnosia? the answer is obviously yes. And these are two other of my collaborators. This is Shlomo Benton he's a professor in the Department of Psychology at Hebrew University, and he was very instrumental in getting me interested in this while he was on a sabbatical at Berkeley a few years ago. And this is Mark Desposito, who is director of the Brain Imaging Center at Berkeley and part of the Helen Wills Neuroscience Center. And if you want to go online and answer our questions, and if you're interested in being in research, that's the address. Okay, thank you. Yes?
Have you noticed any other differences in the abilities of your subjects, like differences in language recognition or voice recognition?
Have we looked at differences, other differences in language or differences in, what was that last one?
Recognizing people by voice.
Recognizing people by voice. We have not looked at recognizing people by voice, although the literature reports that people do not have that problem. In fact, developmental prosopagnosics rely a lot on sound and the voice. In language, we haven't done systematic sorts of studies with language because all the neuropsych tests we've ever given anybody, and as far as the literature is concerned, they always are in the normal range or even better than normal.
Some recent research shows that sometimes they have a harder time reading, or it takes longer to develop their reading skills. So some of the stuff.
Sometimes, well, there are anecdotal reports that they were slow readers, slow in learning reading and that sort of thing. So there might be something. Now, we have looked at other perceptual abilities, and we're looking at reaction time. We're looking at really subtle differences, but we have found when you have to organize something on the basis of a configuration, what we have found, others have found, like for instance, if there's moving dots, congenital prosopagnosics have a little harder time with that than the others. So that again is a configural processing type of skill. And we found a bit of that too, just in stationary stimuli. Yeah.
On the other hand, facial expression also be similar task. You mentioned that it doesn't always.
Okay, so the statement is, and it's a good one, that expression should also be deficient in these individuals because that requires configural information. In fact, it doesn't. What you can look at, I mean, you don't need to configure the mouth with the eyes in order to see that the eyes are smiling. And so you can look at features, and this is really what we think is going on when you're not trained up, is that these individuals, the developmental prosopagnosic, are looking at individual features in your face. They're not making the gestalt like you and I do. So when you're looking at individual features, then if the mouth is down and the eyes are smiling, you're not going to have the influence from the mouth to the eyes. So they end up then scoring as well as normals and being able to differentiate expressions.
Thank you.